Hello, everyone, and welcome to WTF Politics. I'm your host, Fred Lonsdale. Thank you for joining me in this monthly installment of all things politics, campaigns, and political happenings in the run up to the 2024 election. This is episode 2 Immigration. All gas, no brakes. Since we're going to be doing this all the way to November, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. Also, episode 1 was put out last month, and the link to that is below, or it's going to be in the end credits. If you haven't checked it out yet, be sure to do so. It's a fairly honest take on Donald Trump and how he has seized control of the Republican Party and has positioned himself as the inevitable Republican nominee. I was correct. He won the Nevada caucus. He won the South Carolina primary, and a few days ago he won the Michigan primary. And perhaps most humorously, he wasn't on the ballot in the Nevada primary. Nevada had a caucus and a primary. He wasn't on the ballot in the Nevada primary because he's being indicted for possible crimes against the country. But his chief rival, Nikki Haley, actually lost the Nevada primary to, quote, another candidate. So yeah, we got Trump as our nominee. Anyway, so like I said, this is episode 2, Immigration, all gas, no brakes. So originally I wanted to talk about voter demographics, but immigration has become the hot topic in this country and something that, in my opinion, is being felt at the federal, state, and local level of government, and by extension, the people. I'm an immigrant myself, and obviously my experience was radically different to many of the immigrants currently arriving. Right, I came as a kid when with my parents, and when they came from England. Sorry, I lost my light there. But I also work as an adult ESL teacher at a nonprofit in Boston. So I am seeing this issue and its impact play out in real time. I want to start out by saying that the immigration crisis is not the fault of people who are coming to the United States to escape violence, poverty, and internal conflicts. Rather, it is a complete and total fuck up by our government at almost every level. I'm not going to sit here and say it's the Republicans' fault or it's the Democrats' fault, right? You can go to Fox News, CNN, any number of politicians' social media feeds for that. Instead, we are going to take an honest look at this country's failures in dealing with immigration and how it all relates to the 2024 election. So let's start by looking at how this issue is framed on a federal level in terms of the influx of immigrants and with the claim that there's a crisis. Well, guess what? There's been an immigration crisis in every single election year since I was first able to vote. For reference sake, that was 2006 for governor of Massachusetts and 2008 for president. It's a problem that is framed as having no easy solutions, and this is somewhat true. And that in turn sort of begets inaction or half measures or just downright ridiculousness. And look, the corporate media, the conservative movement, and politicians in both parties, and mostly Republicans, but Democrats do this a lot too, they take every opportunity to try and pass the blame around. But in reality, the problems surrounding immigration exist mostly because they're convenient problems to have for many of these actors. It's not about solving the actual issues related to immigration. It's about political optics, right? Who's perceived to be weak and strong on this issue. And once, immigrants come into the country, conservatives want to look like they're tough, no nonsense when it comes to these illegals. And liberals want to look like they're compassionate and practical problem solvers, right? But really, all it does is it just creates a situation where misinformation, opinions, and inaction from both the right and the left are looked at more favorably than the facts and practical solutions. And this is where the news media comes in, right? As they try to cover, immigration, like many other issues they try to cover, as if there are two legitimate sides to the argument, right? And then they try and cover said argument. But the problem is that folks on one side of the argument, the liberal side, seem completely unable and or unwilling to articulate their ideas and solutions. They know that any solution or policy they put forth is going to be unpopular with one group or another. So they just become more concerned about how their opinions and potential policies will sound in, these big media sound bites. And on the other side of the argument, the conservative side, you have a bunch of lunatics, who aren't really interested in reality or fact, right? Their opinions, are they're not grounded in, the reality or the facts of what's going on. Instead, they spout a bunch of nonsensical ideas and conspiracy theories. So, going back to the corporate media, they want to create a perceived threat, right? Fear sells, and with it comes higher television ratings, more clicks, more advertisement dollars. And I mean, what's scarier than thinking that there are thousands of murderers, rapists, and terrorists gatecrashing their way into the United States with no way to stop them, no way to catch them, and no way to even know who they are once they're in the country. I think like a real world organic example of how the media plays the game, sort of the clearly in my opinion, the biggest, gotcha moment on immigration was the migrant caravan of 2018, where thousands of illegals were purportedly marching unopposed towards the U.S.-Mexico border. And if you didn't know any better, you spent your time, watching Fox News, you'd think there were thousands upon thousands of migrants coming to invade a country that itself is made up of immigrants. And it was all to create a buzz and intrigue around the 2018 midterm elections, right? To feed the machine that is the 24-hour news cycle, right? The playbook is sensationalize a story, get everyone all heated, and then as soon as things start to cool, on to something new, right? Next story. Republicans embraced the migrant caravan story as the latest, greatest catastrophe for, America as we know it. And Democrats seized on it as a stark example of then President Donald Trump's failed and ineffective immigration policy. Well, Republicans ended up getting fucking whitewashed in that election. America voted in Democrats into the House, and, the conservative nightmare Nancy Pelosi became leader of the opposition. And, what became of all these invading illegals in the migrant caravan? Nothing. They just sort of disappeared into the ether. And that was it. No more migrant caravan. But yeah, most of the problems in this country related to immigration start at the top with the federal government and then roll downhill to create problems at the state level, which in turn these problems get passed on to the local level. So, for example, at the federal level, immigrants are allowed to claim asylum, giving them the ability to remain in the U.S. until they get into immigration court to see if their asylum claim is valid or not. But the immigration courts are so understaffed, so underfunded, and so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of cases that it can take years to even begin the preliminary stages of an asylum hearing. Not to resolve it, just to begin the process, right? So the burden of caring for incoming migrants falls disproportionately on whatever state they end up in, and in turn, whatever municipality they end up in. And those municipalities have overwhelmingly been major cities. And you would think that maybe the federal government, okay, they haven't been funding, the sort of the processing element, but maybe they're putting their resources into areas such as resettlement programs or temporary housing facilities, or maybe at least trying to streamline the asylum process. But for the most part, no, it's just been inaction. A lot of rhetoric and political theater. And I think the political theater was no more evident than earlier this month when Congress was negotiating a bill that turned out to be one of the most conservative pieces of immigration legislation in recent history. The bill added many restrictions for immigrants entering as asylum seekers, gave the president far-reaching powers when it comes to the southern border, and provided a substantial increase in funding for border security. The provisions on immigration gave Republicans in Congress about 90% of what they wanted on border security, and Democrats were willing to take the deal because, one, it was tied to increased military aid for Ukraine, and two, they would be able to say, look, this isn't ideal, but we're doing something. Our hands are tied here. But Republicans, oddly enough, they torpedoed their own legislation after Donald Trump made some phone calls, sent a couple tweets, and then Republicans became convinced that they would give President Joe Biden a win during an election year. And so instead, they pivoted to impeach Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas, claiming that his office had not done enough to detain migrants at the southern border and that he had lied to Congress when he said that the borders were secure. And I've been talking about asylum, so I'd just like to take a second to point out here, or to point out the facts and dispel any misinformation that the majority of immigrants that have been coming into this country in the past few years are not illegals. They're asylum seekers, okay? Asylum claims offer a certain legal framework for incoming immigrants, and more importantly, give protections against deportation until they can essentially get a hearing, like their day in court, to see if they have a valid claim to be granted asylum. The problem here is that when when someone comes into the U.S. as an asylum seeker, they enter into this protracted legal process that can take years to shake out. So, as I said, the lack of direction and practical solutions from the federal government shifts the responsibility mostly to the state governments, who seem even less competent and prepared to deal with immigration. And depending on the state, the approach to newly arriving migrants can be radically different. In conservative states, you have governors and state legislatures who are more interested in complaining and, doing political stunts than finding solutions. In liberal states, you have governors and state legislatures who all agree that we need to offer practical solutions, but more often than not just seem like they're throwing shit at the wall and seeing if it sticks. Really what it is, it's the old tired notion of 50 states, 50 solutions. And that approach has never once worked in the history of the United States of America. So, I'm going to take a second to talk about my home state, Massachusetts. Here we are not exempt from having a large influx of immigrants, and we have our own systemic problems that are being exacerbated by these new arrivals. We have new migrants arriving on a daily basis into a state that is facing a massive housing crisis, both in terms of affordability and availability. We have a state legislature who all say the influx of immigrants is exacerbating systemic problems like housing and education, but then refuse to do anything to actually address these systemic problems. And at the top, we have a governor, Maura Healey. She is a Democrat, and like I said, everyone's to blame here. This is a fuck up. It doesn't matter the party. This is a fuck up of just government and politicians in general. right? So we have a governor, Maura Healey, who on her best day seems befuddled with how to deal with all of it, right? We have reached a point in this state where all emergency shelter options have long since been exhausted, and we now have families sleeping in the arrivals terminal at Logan International Airport on a nightly basis. The solutions offered up by Governor Healey have ranged from comically absurd to borderline infuriating. On the I can't imagine why that didn't work end of the spectrum, we had the governor and her lieutenant governor publicly call on residents of Boston's wealthy suburbs, cities like Brookline, Wellesley, and Newton, to offer up any spare bedrooms they might have to new arrivals. And this was back in August, by the way, and apart from a few feel-good slash deflect attention news stories, it's been about as successful as you'd think. And on the wow, really end of the spectrum, the state basically appropriated a large community center in Roxbury, which is a neighborhood of Boston, to indefinitely shelter newly arrived immigrants. Now, on paper, this seems like it could be a good idea. But in reality, it was the state taking over a community center in one of, if not the poorest neighborhoods in Boston, while in the next breath asking people in some of the wealthiest towns and cities on the east coast of the United States, basically, anyone got a spare bedroom? Like, again, Massachusetts has been at or over capacity on emergency shelters for a year now. And it's not like thousands of immigrants just showed up overnight on some random Tuesday. You know, I can forgive Maura Healey, her administration, and the Massachusetts state legislature for getting caught off guard and not having a plan at the beginning. But to not have a plan at this stage of the game is alarming, right? State officials are talking about converting an empty office building into an overflow shelter, and okay, I guess that's not nothing. But really, this is something that should have been set in motion months ago. They're just starting to try and answer the question, like, is this even feasible? Not to mention that for the past year, it seems like Massachusetts has just been throwing money at this for things like temporary housing, meals, other forms of assistance, in a state where so many people are struggling with housing and paying rent to begin with. I mean, it's not every conversation I have, but it really does feel like, at least half the conversations, I have with people in the Boston area are about how rents have gotten out of control and that people are being priced out of the city. And to reiterate, I want to be clear here, like, it isn't the money part or the immigrants getting temporary housing that bothers me, right? Our taxes go towards paying for infinitely more stupid things than sheltering people who are fleeing violence and crippling poverty. What bothers me is the lack of a basic plan to both tackle the issue at hand, but also how to solve the more systemic problems that have popped up around it, such as housing affordability, right? People rather justifiably get upset when they believe immigrants are getting free or state-subsidized housing while they're struggling to pay their rent. And again, if steps were being taken to address, the housing crisis, then fine, okay, yeah. But the Massachusetts state legislature and Governor Healey's administration seem totally unwilling to even consider legislation that would institute a policy like rent control. Right, with most of them just dismissing the idea out of hand. Like, that's never going to work. Well, have you fucking tried, you assholes? Right? And it's not just housing. The public school systems in many of the urban areas of this state are having to deal with the fact that they're receiving large and unplanned influxes of non-native English-speaking students in the middle of a school year. And again, if steps were being taken to fix the systemic issue, then fine. But I can tell you from firsthand experience working in the public school system, they are not. We have large discrepancies in funding from school district to school district, And we also have a massive shortage of ESL teachers in this state, right? As an ESL teacher, I work as an adult ESL teacher. I can honestly say there is very little incentive for me in terms of finances, energy, and perhaps most damning on this one, the procedural effort, right? Like, licenses, advanced degrees that it would take to switch from adult education to K through 12. And I'm like ESL teachers, we have a shortage of ESL teachers. That's my job. The point is that having some sort of tangible solutions for issues that affect huge swaths of our state's population in a real way would go a very long way in providing cover to both state officials who are administering assistance programs, but more importantly for immigrants who are accessing them. And so, as I alluded to before, the problems surrounding immigration, they roll downhill due to the lack of leadership at the federal and state level. And as such, municipal governments, local services, and really the people who live in these cities overwhelmingly seem to be the ones who are tasked with offering solutions and doing what needs to be done. Basically, we have to shoulder the weight here, right? Here in Boston, I gave the example of the community center in Roxbury. Being taken over and used as an emergency shelter. I do cut our city's mayor, Michelle Wu, a lot of slack on this particular issue. I will say I'm starting to have my qualms with her about other things, but here I think she's been handed one shit sandwich by the federal government and then turned around just to be handed another shit sandwich by the state government, right? The governments of our major cities, right, are being asked to offer services that not only should be the responsibility of the federal and state governments, but are having to do so when they have their own deep-rooted and systemic issues that are and have been affecting the people who are already living in these cities. And it all comes back to what I said earlier, right? It's more convenient to let the problems surrounding immigration persist and pay lip service to them than to actually do something about it. Republicans on both the federal and state level often make decisions or propose solutions that are either super racist and or objectively stupid. And that's because they'd rather play up to their base voters who are often more than ready to embrace the super racist and or the objectively stupid. Like the idea that immigrants are coming to take the highly lucrative and super cushy jobs in the agricultural sector and service industry, because it doesn't get much better than harvesting grain and fruit in 100+ degree weather for minimum wage. And remember Trump's Muslim ban, the Muslim ban, right? It was meant to keep out refugees from a variety of Middle Eastern countries. But in practice, it essentially banned medical professionals, scientists, and a variety of graduate students from being able to return to the U.S. after the holiday season. Or you can take, Texas, where their governor, Greg Abbott, his administration has wasted money, time, and all sorts of resources on busing migrants into other states when they could have easily used those on resettlement or family unification programs. Because you guessed it, Texas has one of the highest immigrant populations in the country, right? People are already there. The point is that for Republicans, it's not about solving a problem, but rather creating a race to the bottom in order to score political points and look like they're owning the libs. And I also need to say that the use of misinformation is key for them here, and I kind of hinted at it before. Conservatives, their go-to play when it comes to keeping the problems of immigration alive and well, is basically fear-mongering and whataboutisms. And they're fairly easy arguments to refute, but the problem is that you're essentially throwing facts and evidence at people who don't believe in facts and evidence. You can make the most convincing, airtight case you want, proving them wrong beyond a shadow of a doubt, and they will just pivot to you're a sheep who believes what they want you to believe. I mean, there's a widespread belief in most conservative circles that illegal immigrants are allowed to vote. They are not. That is why you, me, and everyone else needs to register to vote. We're talking about something that is pretty common sense here, right? It's pretty logical. Like, if you're not registered to vote, you can't vote. And then, add to that, like, why would any immigrant risk arrest, imprisonment, and certain deportation to cast one vote and commit voter fraud in a nation of 365 million people? But if you try to talk to any conservative, they will immediately bring up a series of whataboutisms and cite, anecdotal cases of things that more than likely didn't happen, all in an effort to try and drag the conversation into the weeds and make the nonsensical conspiracy theory seem somewhat believable. The problem for Democrats is that they don't know whether they want to walk or run, so more often than not, they just end up standing still. Right? They try to find solutions to please everyone, but when it comes to immigration, there will always be people who say policies go too far and those that say they don't go far enough. Some of this has to do with the fact that the Democratic Party likes to think of itself as a big tent party, but all that really does is make the lack of cohesive solutions and divergent ideas more apparent, right? Moderates seem happy to compromise with Republicans as they're able to say, hey, we're doing something, while at the same time being able to place blame or give credit, depending on your political leanings, on conservatives for all the hardline aspects of any law or policy, right? Progressives and the liberal wing will turn around and blame moderates, but that's because they don't really have many, if any, solutions, for the issue of immigration. And I say that as a progressive myself. We tend to talk about, this in academic terms, right? Like, the United States has been a destabilizing force in Latin America. U.S. foreign policy is to blame for mass migrations, the war on drugs, etc., etc. Look, all this is true, but it doesn't really do anything to address the actual issues and problems that surround immigration into the United States, right? Should we stop meddling in countries whose governments we oppose? Yeah, absolutely. But you can't undo the past, and focusing on long-term abstract solutions, number one, does nothing to help the current situation, and you just kind of lose people, right, at the end of the day. So my advice to Joe Biden and the Democratic Party as a whole is to pick 2 or 3 concrete solutions and run with them, right? Things that you can actually do. I would focus on narrowing the guidelines for what constitutes asylum claims. I'd also, focus on directing resources towards processing, incoming immigrants and immigrants that are already here instead of enforcement. And possibly, I would focus on, possibly creating a national resettlement program whereby immigrants are encouraged to move to cities and states with decreasing populations. And look, you aren't going to please everyone. That's impossible. But having a plan is infinitely better than coming in with the tired political catchphrases like, we will work with our Republican colleagues to come up with a bipartisan common sense solution. It's basically saying, vote for us and we'll figure it out then. You don't come off as a deal maker or a problem solver, especially when your grand plan relies on the strong possibility of having to negotiate with a bunch of lunatics. Do I think the Democratic Party will follow my advice? Not a chance, right? Because no one snatches defeat from the jaws of victory and just sort of trips over their own feet like the Democratic Party of the United States of America. So yeah, to give you the too long, didn't read of all this, immigration is going to be a major topic in the 2024 election. Republicans, they're going to want to go on the offensive like they normally do, right? Perpetuating, the narrative that there's a crisis and a disaster at the southern border. Democrats, in my belief, and that's because it's just rather predictable, I would say, they'll be playing defense and basically trying not to put their foot in their mouths. Trump, he's going to be as Trump as ever. Trump will be spouting, all the racist, xenophobic rhetoric of the past. He's going to lean into his hardline stances on immigration. And yes, we will all be hearing about the wall to no end. Biden, for his part, he'll try and highlight his willingness to tackle a complex issue it shouldn't really be this complex with bipartisanship and, really sort of remind everybody about his history in the Senate. And, "Hey, look, people, I worked with these guys, we can come up with something." So, yeah, that's it for WTF Politics this week. Thank you all for watching. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons for algorithm purposes. You should also have a couple of videos on your screen that might interest you further. Like I said, last week's episode about Donald Trump. Also, I've put in my final prediction video from the 2020 presidential election, just in case anyone needs to see my credentials on this whole thing. So just a heads up that this is a monthly show. I just hit the buzzer, right? Just got right under there. I'm recording February 29th. Happy Leap Day, everybody. So yeah, just got in there in February. So you should all plan on the next video coming out towards the end of March. Try not to go all scorched earth on everyone on my next topic. Cheers, guys.